Great.
Ready? All right, welcome everyone. This is the third day of the Global Conference for Science Diaspora Networks. We're so excited. We've had a fantastic lineup of speakers, panelists discussing diverse topics, very specialized in terms of how can science help governments, science diplomacy, science communication, science leadership, examples from how to serve the local community in your country to how do you boost science and what are the different programs available. Today we have with us Dr. Declan Kiran. He's the managing director of the ISC Intelligence and Science Belgium. Declan Kiran is not just the managing director of this fantastic organization, which is Intelligence and Science, a specialized science, technology, and R&D public affairs firm based in Brussels. And ISC develops and implements strategic research agendas for science and technology-based organizations in the EU and US. His practice areas cover IP, R&D, consortia development, management, and dissemination, and is responsible for themes of ICT, health, security, defense, space, and related policies, legislation, programs, and funding mechanisms. His background is analyzing the relationship between public and private R&D funding and the impact on R&D performance. He has worked extensively on science and technology policy evaluation methodologies and technology options for policy and decision makers. The EU's digital agenda, emerging European space, security, and science policies are part of his remit. We're so glad to have you with us. And this is in parallel with your own conference, the Science Summit, and in parallel with the United Nations General Assembly. So timely, so fitting for you to share with us about how do we harness the potential of global diaspora scientists to serve the globe. The floor is yours.
Absolutely. Good morning, Dr. Dajani. Delighted to be here. And congratulations on taking this important initiative. It's entirely relevant, it's very timely, and it's extremely necessary. Really, just thank you again for giving me the floor, or rather, as you say, the screen. I suppose really from my standpoint, the issue of diaspora is hugely important, as you've already articulated, and for the very obvious reasons that it provides an established network among scientists globally. I think this is hugely important for the very obvious reason that we are absolutely very committed to the need for extending and enabling global collaboration on science, research and development and innovation. So again, it is wonderful to be here. So a couple of really just reflections, and I think you have alluded to some of them already. You see, in my experience, of course, we're here with the United Nations during the General Assembly, and my objective at the Science Summit here in New York is to advance a greater understanding and awareness of the contribution of science to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and beyond the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, and also looking at how we work together to achieve common purpose and bring together scientists from numerous and varied backgrounds. So I think this is hugely relevant. Now, just reflecting on the themes of the summit, and we have two really, beyond obviously the focus on science itself and different areas of scientific activity, but the overarching priorities and themes are two, and the first is inclusion. So clearly, I think we can readily understand how diaspora is very important regarding inclusion and bringing people from varied backgrounds, and I suppose also bringing your network and the Arab science diaspora globally to connect them with their home countries, and the same would apply to Irish diaspora and Spanish diaspora and so on and so forth. So this is tremendously important. And I think by default, many people, everybody indeed, would be absolutely supportive of the importance of inclusion. And I think the immediate understanding of that would be to include more people from varied backgrounds and cultures and races and experiences for sharing and for shared purposes. And I think this is hugely good. However, listening to the presenters during the Science Summit and just reflecting on some of my own research, I think it's actually not so simple. And the reason I say that is because, again, traditionally inclusion means, as I've just outlined, assembling, more varied cohorts of people to advance the science agenda globally. However, we need to understand this also in very practical terms, and the practical context I want to just focus on for a second is data, and particular data protection. Again, we only have sufficient minutes here today, but my take on this is that in terms of inclusion, the emergence of data protection regulations in advanced economies, by which essentially I mean the European Union and its member states, the United States, Canada, Japan, and a number of others. The advancement of regulations, there are a whole range of regulations dealing with aspects, for example, of medical science, but I'll just focus on the General Data Protection Regulation, the so-called GDPR, just for a moment. And this has very noble and lofty ambitions in terms of creating a very stable environment for citizens' data and the protection of that data. And I think this is a hugely worthwhile cause, and I think we can all get behind that. However, it does have consequences, and I believe these to be, in my experience, somewhat unintended, if not unforeseen. And in particular, the European Union's GDPR regulation comes with extraterritorial application, and this means it applies indeed everywhere, as far as I understand it. And this would include many less developed nations. And here we have a situation that it's not really entirely understood how this will impact the access to data, the exchange of data, the use of data for machine learning, artificial intelligence, and of course the knowledge emanating and produced by these processes. It's not entirely clear how that's going to work, particularly between the European Union and respective developing nations. So I think we have to understand this, and the point I'd like to make here today is that I think the diaspora has a very important role in advancing a greater understanding of these issues, because they naturally, in the area of science anyway, would want to collaborate, and they would want to share data across borders, if not continents. And this has to be an aspiration. I think this is what global science is really about. But I think we need to understand, and scientists need to take a leadership role in understanding the impacts of the General Data Protection Regulation and the related data privacy regulations in the United States and other developed nations, because I think they have the potential to be a barrier to innovation. I stress, I think the full implications are not understood yet. I think there still is a process of jurisprudence, but here at the United Nations, or rather, I mean, globally, including here at the United Nations, I think there's a strong commitment, particularly with COVID in mind, a strong commitment to enabling these global collaborations. But it's not just an aspirational thing; it has to be, and I use the word decidedly, enabled. And this means access to data. It means access to funding. It means contract management systems that allow cooperation across borders. And I'm increasingly of the view that these enabling aspects of global collaborations are still quite juvenile. I don't see them progressing. in particular, many states many developed nations do have a strong political commitment to international cooperation, but this is not really manifest in specific legal or funding mechanisms which make this easy to happen. In particular, funding collaboratively either nations in a development context between and amongst themselves, or between these nations and advanced economies. This is still, in my view, a very, very juvenile process. And I think this needs to be advanced considerably. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to address common challenges, which the SDGs essentially are designed to address. So this is where, I feel the diaspora and scientists more generally have a vitally important role to play. And I say, choosing my words carefully, I say that the role of scientists needs to include engagement with policymakers. And I go so far as to say that, in fact, scientists are policymakers, or indeed need to become policymakers, because otherwise we're looking at a world which unfortunately is becoming more potentially fragmented. Because when you look at the impact if you look at the aspect of regulation and its impact on scientific activity, and again, there are many other examples. I referred to the GDPR. I now refer to regulations covering in vitro diagnostics, clinical trials, and medical devices in the area of medical science and health research. There are many others in the areas of the bioeconomy and digital transition. There are others dealing with market access and so on and so forth. So I want to stress there are a gambit of regulations, and by and large, these are being advanced by developed economies. And my point this morning, or indeed this afternoon, or wherever you are, is that the scientific community need to be very aware of these and need to develop positions. And positions look like position papers, they look like engagement, they look like informing policy and decision makers. And this needs to happen. It needs to happen at a common level. It needs to happen at a global level. Now, I think this also calls for leadership, and by leadership I mean the importance and vital need for scientists and related stakeholders to take ownership of these issues, to develop a policymaker engagement process, and to demonstrate leadership. And I think the key word here is leadership, not only in scientific pursuits, but also in enabling scientific pursuits. And again, this means creating the enabling environment for this. In terms of global regulation, again, from the perspective of the United Nations, and I'm a big fan. It really is the only globally convening platform, the globally convened platform that we have. So I think we need to enable it. We need to support it more so now than ever, perhaps. But with that in mind, I would also just like to point out that there is no global regulatory authority. We live in a very fragmented world from the point of view of regulations, and the ones in particular that I have mentioned. These essentially are block or country level developments, and I know, for example, that never mind developing nations, but certainly between the European Union and the United States, there is still a job to be done in working out a common purpose, a common cause, or a common approach that would enable a more enabling environment for collaborative research, about which we were talking this morning, but also more generally in terms of economic and economic development, which is what we all aspire to. But having said that, another theme that I think is relevant here is that we are beginning to, again, in the West, there's been a very strong commitment to competitiveness, and we are all working towards a greater competitiveness, because this is seen as a worthy objective, indeed a necessary objective. However, I think there are other views, and we're learning of these other views, and I'm not saying the views are necessarily exclusive. I'm just saying that we need to be more comprehensive in the way we look at global research, and it was pointed out in a lecture a number of days ago that, in fact, one aspect of a competitive approach to science and research and innovation is that it is also in a fundamentally adversarial, and pits researchers, research communities and institutions against each other. And in the view of some, this can be very debilitating and can be not conducive to a collaboration, the sharing of data in many ways that we would expect. It also militates against, in my view, a trust-enabling environment, and I think this needs to sit alongside the consideration of a regulated approach to data protection and the other aspects and the other regulations that I have referred to earlier on. And with this in mind, and pointing to the global aspect of Diaspora and the fact that it is the Diaspora network is a ready-made network, of course, and I think it has the potential to bring shared experiences together in many ways, and of course it pertains and relates to different cultures in different ways. I've mentioned the Arab diaspora and the Irish. Of course, there are many others. There's the Armenian, and there's the Greek, and so on and so forth. So, this is a common fact of modern life. But I think in the area of science, I think the diaspora has a hugely important role to play in addressing the challenges for global cooperation and collaboration. And I think as part of this dialogue and this meeting, perhaps there might be the opportunity to formulate working groups amongst diaspora and, of course, policymakers. I think this might be a way to advance approaches to the regulatory environments that I've mentioned, but also in a very constructive way to engage on the emerging, not emerging, the already established, but vastly more emerging dialogue around, for example, Indigenous knowledge and the relationship between Indigenous knowledge and more established forms of knowledge in terms of patents and intellectual properties. I think these need to be considered. And again, the diaspora, by virtue of them being dispersed globally, can play an important role in that. And I think this then, such a working group as I'm recommending, could then provide a forum for input to policymakers and policy making. And I think this then can be a huge value, not just as a mechanism for information sharing, but also, if you like, an early warning system, so that we can from the diaspora learn what is happening at global level and use that then to design and optimize policy and policy making. So with that in mind, I would just like to conclude by saying that the diaspora and the related science community absolutely have to be engaged in broadly the policy and regulatory making space. Otherwise, we risk, in my view, jeopardizing scientific advancement and progress. And this is nobody's fault. This is happening unintentionally and without a systematic approach. This then will, I think, result in possibly weaker global collaborations at a time when we need stronger collaborations. And that's my key message this morning, or indeed this afternoon, wherever you are. So, Madam Chairman, Professor Denjani, I now would like to hand back to you, and again congratulate you on bringing together this group and advancing this very important discussion. And I hope this meeting is understood as part of a very important dialogue process, and that it will continue under your leadership. So thank you so much for giving me the space and opportunity to meet with you and discuss this morning. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those wise words and advice and recommendations going forward. I think they are much needed, and especially in the environment of this month of September of policymakers meeting, that the voice of scientists are valuable, actually priceless, to advance our sustainable development goals and to create a better, more peaceful world for our future generations. So thank you very, very much. And these words will be included in our final report that we are preparing as a global diaspora, like you said, from different countries around the world, that diaspora scientists can actually take and use and go to their governments and say, look, this happened, these are the recommendations, and this is how we want to help. Maybe one last question before we end. How would you advise a scientist when they go back to their country, and if you want to take yourself or examples from people you've encountered, how would you go knock the door of the policymakers? Like, what's one small concrete step you suggest?
It's essentially, it is the small step is networking together, and a second part of the first step is then communicating, and that's essentially what we're doing in New York here. And I in my experience, if I could humbly suggest, I feel I think, I hope it's not an incorrect term, but the Arab science community needs to be more visible on this. I think the Arab science community have very valuable perspectives, and those perspectives need to be understood. And at the moment, when I say we, I mean in a very general term, we're not aware of that, and I think that also points to perhaps another issue, which is the importance of science policies in the Arab world by Arab states. I think this needs to be advanced. And I point to the fact that certainly in Europe, maybe 30 years ago, you didn't have science policies. You had science programs, and perhaps the listeners here today need to understand they are different things. It's only relatively recently that science policy has emerged as the umbrella policy for supporting science funding. So I'm just making that distinction, that there needs to be obviously these funding mechanisms, but the importance, and in order to sustain funding, there needs to be an underlying policy basis. Otherwise, the program stuff comes and it goes, it comes and it goes, and it's not sustainable. It doesn't sustain, and it makes the job of the scientist in securing and maintaining funding sources doubly difficult. So the underlying policy basis is vitally important, and I would encourage scientists to absolutely advance that need. It does take, of course, some perspective. It does take bandwidth. I understand that, but it is far better to build a policy foundation for science than to keep applying for funding.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And those are good advice for scientists to get out of their labs and go knock those doors. And like you said, network and connect and communicate. And even if you don't get a response the first time, it's just being persistent. At some point, you have a breakthrough. And there's so many good examples that could help. And like you said, it's about creating that ecosystem that is supportive for doing the work. Well, thank you very much, Declan. And we are following your science summit at the same time, and we hope that this will be a beginning of future collaborations in a journey of helping each other, connecting, communicating to make this world a better place. Have a great
Absolutely.
day. Yeah, have a great day wherever you are, and thank you very much.
Thank you, professors. Thank you indeed. Thank you. Have a great day.